As the sun sets on 2018, it's time for us to once again reflect on what we played throughout the year. In 2018, we played everything from NES, PC Engine, and Sega Genesis, on up to Switch, Xbox One, and PlayStation VR. So as always for us, this is not your typical Game of the Year list. Mostly we'll be focusing on our favorite games that we actually finished in 2018, but there are also a few others that we just had to talk about. So let's dig in. These are the games that we enjoyed in 2018.
I think it's safe to say that time really got away from me this year. The number of games I was able to put a significant amount of time into was way down this year. That said, I did play a lot of incredible games, some brand new, and others where it was about time that I finally got around to them. Although I rarely get into first-person shooters these days, I'd heard a lot of praise for one of last year's biggest flops, Titanfall 2.
Marauder's Core, weapons hot! Stand by for Titanfall!
I don't have a lot of interest in online competitive deathmatch, so hearing that the single player was exceptionally great convinced me to grab it for around $10. Wow, what an experience. This is perhaps the smoothest first-person shooter I've ever played. From wall running to double jumping, you feel like you can do just about anything. The Titans themselves feel like lumbering beasts, but are nonetheless agile. This certainly makes all other FPSs feel sluggish in comparison. A relatively breezy 6-hour campaign is all killer with no filler. From time travel to bounding from spaceship to spaceship, you're doing something different in every single level.
Nice jump!
Titanfall 2 was super fun to play, and exactly the kind of single-player experience I look for these days.
The arm is dangerous. All units in the area, proceed to the southeast elevator bank.
Mega Man 11 was a must-play from the second it was announced, and it certainly didn't let me down.
Ready!
At first, I was a little bit nervous about the addition of the gear system, which allows you to slow down time or power up your attacks because they seem to deviate from the tried and true Mega Man formula. Thankfully, these injected some much needed spice into the mix after the back to basics of 9 and 10, and felt right at home. There were also some other liberties taken to help bring the original series into the modern era, like longer levels, quality of life improvements, and multi-tiered boss battles. Mega Man 11 serves as a base that will hopefully be expanded upon with the eventual Mega Man 12, leading to a Mega Man 1 to Mega Man 2 style evolution of excellence. Here's to another 30 years of Mega Man games. Without a doubt, the most egregious example of "it's about time that I played that" was Sonic Mania. When it released in August of 2017, I decided to hold off on buying it for a little bit because I simply didn't have time to play it. While the game drew rave reviews from everyone who tried it, once the initial hype passed and I still hadn't bought it, well, I decided to just play it cool and see if a physical release was announced. Nearly a year later, that physical release arrived in the form of Sonic Mania Plus, which included new DLC on the cart along with tweaks and refinements to the original game. In anyone else's hands, this probably would have been yet another ride on the Sonic Cycle merry-go-round. But the amount of passion poured into this game is truly inspiring. Although this is a love letter to the original Sonic games, it was the little touches that celebrate Sega's overall history that really made me smile. Even the package's reverse Sega Genesis style cover was designed with care to accuracy, although I do feel it would have been best if it was a Sega Saturn cover. The remixed music tracks are simply fantastic, but the new tracks stand shoulder to shoulder with them, picking up right where Sonic and Knuckles left off. And I really need to mention the perfect looking CRT filter, which is likely the best interpretation I've ever seen in a game, taking the crown from last year's Wild Guns Reloaded. Of course, it's not perfect. I felt that the levels got a little bit too long toward the end, so So much so that I even ran out of time in a few instances, which is something that never killed me in a previous Sonic game. And I still really, really dislike Blue Sphere. After how amazing and fresh Sonic Mania felt after 2 decades of build-up, I'm not sure if a perfect storm can ever come together like this again. Regardless, Sega should just let these guys revive absolutely any dormant franchise in their library, because they pulled off a miracle here. This is the best Sonic game ever made, and deserves all the praise it received. While Sonic Mania relished in the past, it was a little game by the name of AstroBot Rescue Mission that took the platformer boldly into the future with the use of the PlayStation VR. As someone who had little to no interest in VR previously, this is as much of a surprise to me as it probably is to you. I was told that this game was VR's Mario 64 moment, and once you try it, this becomes a very apt description. It's very hard for me to describe and show you what it's like. You simply need to play it and experience it for yourself.
Coury's excitement over AstroBot was a big part of what made me feel like it was finally time to buy into PlayStation VR. And wow, it really does feel like a very new way to experience a game world. Whereas Super Mario 64 introduced many of us to what 3D platforming could be within the confines of a two-dimensional viewing surface, AstroBot immediately feels like something beyond the 3D that we already know. As you view the world in 360 degrees around you, you move your body and shift your head to discover secrets and reveal side paths in a way that simply could not be intuitively done with a conventional camera system. AstroBot revels in hiding things in places that just make you smile because these things simply couldn't be done outside of VR. People typically think of VR as being for first-person experiences, but AstroBot has me wondering whether third-person VR might actually be better.
What is that? What? Oh, jeez.
One of my personal top gaming experiences for 2018, well, you can't exactly call it a game unto itself, but in a lot of ways it felt like one. Following the flubbed release of Final Fantasy XIV in 2010 and its shockingly successful rebirth in 2013, the first proper expansion arrived in 2015. I had heard it was good, but having finally played it, Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward blew me away. Of course, there are some barriers of entry. Aside from being part of an MMO, actually playing Heavensward requires the completion of a Realm Reborn's main quest, plus an interim storyline that leads up to the events of the expansion. So this summer, I thought I'd finally just finish up those last missions leading up to Heavensward, but as soon as the events unfolded, whew, wow. Coury and I often talk about Final Fantasy moments. This is among the best.
'Tis hardly the first time, and I'll be damned if it will be the last.
Crazy stuff happens, every character has an awesome moment, and I could just not leave it at that. Up to this point, the story of Final Fantasy XIV had been fine, nothing too special, but it was enjoyable enough. This is one heck of a turning point, and it hardly lets up from there. Heavensward opens up the way to the city of Ishgard, which was visible in the distance all those years ago in the game's 1.0 version. And at last, 8 years later, my character enters, but under circumstances that I very much did not expect. The expansion also adds the lands north of Ishgard along with flying mounts such as the classic Black Chocobo. In terms of combat, with the level cap going from 50 to 60, I was very impressed with the progression, with my character's summoner job receiving some fun abilities along the way that improved the flow of combat without my hotbar getting too complicated. But I really mean it when I say that Heavensward is the best Final Fantasy story I've experienced since the late 90s. While a few things happened along the way that I think could have been handled differently, the story pacing gave me a feeling that not many modern RPGs provide. I just binged it. I had to see what was going to happen next at every turn.
He has fixed his attention on Ishgard itself, though he knows full well the eye does not reside there.
Aside from a few dungeons and boss fights along the way, a majority of the story is best tackled solo, traveling along with an engaging cast of NPCs that feels very much like a party that could have formed an SNES or PS1 RPG. It makes me sad to think that most Final Fantasy fans will never experience Heaven's Word just because it's part of an MMO. But if you're not completely opposed to trying a relatively fast-moving MMO and miss that old-school Final Fantasy story feel, I think it's worth investing in. 2018 was also a bit of a Dragon Quest year for me. Obviously there's Dragon Quest XI, the long-awaited single-player console successor to Dragon Quest VIII, which was the game that got me so heavily into the series in the first place. I'm pretty far into 11, but I just didn't have enough time this past fall to finish it just yet. It is very good though, and I've recently hit quite a turning point, so this is a top priority for finishing as soon as possible. I also got a few hours into the first Dragon Quest Heroes, which I hope to chip away at over the early months of 2019. Seems very fun so far. The one Dragon Quest game I did finish in 2018 though is Dragon Quest Builders. I decided to wait on the Nintendo Switch version, which actually plays very nicely and was handy for playing away from home. In fact, I was actually viewing the game's ending minutes before landing at Narita Airport on my first ever trip to Japan, which feels very appropriate. I've never been too huge of a Minecraft guy, but Dragon Quest Builders really gives me the mission structure that I need to sink my teeth into a game like this. To beat the game, you complete the quest for 4 towns that you build one at a time in their own chapters, each with their own simple Dragon Quest type story that unfolds as you save the people from the ills that plague them in this dark version of Alfgard that the Dragon Lord now rules. The Minecraft-esque world aesthetic meshes surprisingly seamlessly with Dragon Quest's higher polygon characters and monsters. This is certainly no throwaway spin-off, and it does an excellent job of capturing the sense of adventure that the classic RPGs are known for. 2018 was a year in which I really got back into falling block puzzlers. Puyo Tetris is a clever concept, and the different modes that mix the two games together certainly makes for a lot of fun. It had been so long since I'd played through the single-player adventure or story mode in a game like this, and it was kind of silly and stupid, but I honestly just had a great time doing that. Before Puyo Tetris, the only Puyo variant I owned was Kirby's Avalanche, which has always been a favorite of mine. But boy, go to Japan, you're just about tripping over all the Puyos, and they're mostly all like $5 or less. My curiosity got the better of me and I grabbed several different versions. In particular, I did finish the single-player story in Puyo Sun on PS1, but I sure wish I knew Japanese so I could play this cool-looking RPG mode in Puyo Box.
I'll show you the side of yourself, the person that you've always been, but never did.
But it was Tetris Effect on PlayStation 4 that completely renewed my respect for the most iconic falling blocks puzzler of all time. As a game from Tetsuya Mizuguchi of Luminous and Rez fame, I wasn't sure if the audio-visual aspect would draw me in. But Tetris Effect lets me feel connected to the music in a way that other music games just can't do for me. The game blends graphics, music, and even perfectly tuned DualShock Force feedback to create an experience that literally feels intoxicating. Your eyes are laser focused on the playfield, while everything else that occurs around you, whether in VR mode or simply on a large television, sings and dances in your peripheral vision. Tetris Effect is perfectly designed around the idea of a game that stays in your head hours after you stop playing, and it is indeed hard to stop. The coolest game that Coury and I were able to co-op together this year was A Way Out. This game is the result of an indie studio being given the opportunity to make a polished 3D game with heavy support and funding from Electronic Arts.
You guys seem familiar. Have I seen you before?
Nah, I don't think so.
Okay. Whatever.
The catch, as you may know, is that this is a co-op only experience, no single player mode at all. I really wasn't too sure what to expect at first. Early on, the story and puzzles seemed pretty standard fare, and overall the game felt pretty restrictive. But as it continues on, it becomes clear that A Way Out's strength is the sheer variety it throws your way. You just never quite know what kind of situation you'll be in next. And there were lots of gameplay scenarios in the second half of the game that I was totally not expecting. And these two characters, who I didn't know if I would care about, turned out to have far more interesting stories than I had initially realized.
All right, here we go. Here they come.
Talk about a surprise. I went into A Way Out with very little knowledge of what to expect. Up to release, there was a very clear focus on the prison break sequence. That would lead you to believe that almost the entire game is based around that. But in fact, this is only a tiny portion of the overall narrative. A Way Out does include an option for online co-op, but I highly recommend playing this couch co-op style.
My thumb is like...
Take them down, yeah!
Holy cow.
With so many games being added to my backlog, I still think it's important to revisit games that I've already beaten from time to time. With the prevalence of remasters this generation, it's easier than ever to mix the new and the old while enjoying some good old-fashioned gaming comfort food. I had no idea that Katamari Damacy Reroll, an HD remaster of the original PS2 game for the Nintendo Switch, was so close to release. But the first game was my favorite in the series, and combined with a GameStop exclusive physical edition, I bought it sooner rather than later. I hadn't revisited the game in more than 10 years, and man, this is just as fun as the first time I played it. There's no significant changes or modifications to the overall game, but that's fine. I love the simplicity here, and I felt that at least the second game got bogged down in gimmicky level objectives. Of course, the HD coat of paint is nice, but it's not particularly revelatory due to the graphics being fairly basic in the first place. I didn't notice any frame rate dips as your Katamari grew larger, but I'd hoped that the Switch would be able to handle this. My 6-year-old daughter got a real kick out of it too. It's such a weird game. She wasn't quite sure what to make of it.
Alligator. Oh.
It's a funny game too, more so than I remembered it being. But for some reason, this version removed all the English VO, and I'm not quite sure why. But still, if you've never played a Katamari game, this is the perfect place to start. And if you're like me, you might just get your fill of the entire series in this one game.
宇宙ロケットって思ったより大きくて素敵ですね。
僕も宇宙飛行士になりたくなっちゃった。
ほほほ、お父さんも喜びますよ。ところでお父さんはどこにいるのかしらね。
Although I'm not too good at it these days, I do love me some Street Fighter, especially Championship Edition. When Capcom announced that the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection was on the way, which included all of the arcade revisions of Street Fighter 1 through Third Strike for a total of 12 games, it was an absolute must-buy for me.
Round one, fight!
Outside of an actual arcade PCB, this would be the be-all, end-all compilation for fans of the series. This collection was developed by Digital Eclipse, who has seen a bit of a rebirth in recent years after the success of the Mega Man Anniversary Collection. And they really took things to the next level with this collection, with tons of different scaling options, scan lines, training modes, and online play for select games, making this one of the most lavish compilations I've seen in a long time. But it's the museum section that really elevates us beyond the scope of the usual multi-game compilation. There's a ton of extra material here that is worth the price of entry all by itself. A timeline takes you through each game of the series' 30-year history, with material like artwork, factoids, and complete soundtracks. Although some might be disappointed that this only includes the arcade versions of each game. I mean, home ports would have been amazing, especially for games like Alpha 3, which had a ton of additional characters, but I really can't imagine a Street Fighter collection being better than this.
Whoa!
A few years ago, near the start of the channel, we had an opportunity to make a trailer for an upcoming PC game from Secret Base called Devil's Dare. This multiplayer beat-em-up was a fun homage to arcade quarter munchers. In early 2018, Devil's Dare was ported to the PS4 and Switch under a new name, Streets of Red. This new version included a number of tweaks and changes from the original game, in addition to some new characters. From Final Fantasy VI to Zelda, there's some really fun nods to games and pop culture throughout. You never know who might show up, including Try and I in the background of the survival mode. I was not expecting that. Streets of Red is super fun to play multiplayer, and I loved revisiting this game with my friend Chris on a whim this past summer. February saw the release of the Secret of Mana remake for the PS4. This version was largely scorned because of its bare-bones look that many felt didn't recreate the aesthetic of the original very accurately. I don't know, maybe these people were right, but there's just something about its jank and simplicity that I found endearing, and just flat out fun to play. I guess that's a testament to the core mechanics of the original. I've really made a point to look at this remake for what it is, such as playing with the new arranged soundtrack without dismissing it outright. And you know what? Maybe it's not as good as the original, but it's not that bad either. Some tracks even surpass the original compositions. The original sprites were obviously incredible, but there is an appeal to crisp, simple graphics that make up this new version. I especially love the way that the area map is represented by the original game's graphics.
Hey, bro?
What?
This Eleni witch wasn't always so scary, right?
The voice acting is probably the worst part, although I can dig the greater focus on each of the three main characters' personalities and their interactions. I'm still working my way through it, but this is a game that I'll pop in when I have a little bit of downtime. Don't let the word of mouth distract you too much from this. You might find yourself pleasantly surprised.
I also finished an assortment of games for much older consoles in 2018. The nice thing about a lot of these is that even if they are indeed challenging, they are nonetheless short enough to beat an evening of streaming. In fact, it was during a January stream that I marked my first beat of 2018, Super Mario Bros. 2, the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 for the Famicom Disk System, that is. Unlike the Lost Levels version on SNES, which I finished a long time ago, the FDS original does not have the luxury of being able to save and continue from the start of every level, so I was always afraid to play by the original rules, which has you continue from the start of each world instead. But you know what? Even if it is more vindictive than other Mario games, I think it's possible to get through it with much less effort than plenty of other infamously difficult NES games, and I'd say any fan of classic Mario should make a serious go at it. But without a doubt, the best game I played on my Famicom in 2018 was Seirei Densetsu Lickle, the Japanese version of the infamously expensive Little Samson, which I found in Akihabara for less than 10% of the price of the American version. Little Samson may not be worth $1,500 or whatever it's going for these days, what game really could be, but it is extraordinarily good. 4 playable characters equipped with their own unique abilities and great animations are just the beginning. This really is a top-shelf NES platformer. No matter what method you have to use, I strongly encourage all fans of 8-bit platformers to play through it. One of the best NES cartridges I played this year was the widely celebrated classic, Carnival. Okay, in all seriousness, Carnival is heartily beloved, and the character has become something of a joke for us here on My Life in Gaming. The game itself is not exactly great, but you know what? It's really not that bad. It plays like a mess, but there is a certain charm to its clumsiness, and with infinite continues at your disposal, it's not even that time-consuming to beat. And hey, who could hate a game whose label art features a dude breathing fire at a T-Rex? Looking back, I'd say that I probably had the most fun with the PC Engine in 2018 than any other retro console. The first PC Engine / Turbo Graphics game that I beat in 2018 was Legendary Axe, and what a game this is. With great gameplay and a great soundtrack, Legendary Axe deserves far more attention than it gets. Over the course of the game, you pick up items to increase your axe's maximum damage, but similar to games like Secret of Mana, you have to let your weapon meter fill back up to do the most damage. This creates an interesting pace for a platformer, making it a somewhat slower and more methodical action game where rushing forward too quickly is almost always a bad idea. However, there are also situations where it's helpful to just hold the attack button and let the turbo function do the work for you. It's tough, but very satisfying, and one of my favorite games on the system thus far. Another great one was Valkyrie no Densetsu, Namco's Legend of the Valkyrie. It may not have co-op like the arcade release, but this version is plenty of fun nonetheless. A charming overhead action game similar to the likes of Pocky and Rocky, littered with hidden magic and plenty of other secrets. The PC Engine CD version of Valis: The Legend of the Phantasm Soldier is the second game in the series that I've played after the Genesis version of Valis 3. This one far exceeded my expectations. While Yuko is a very slow-moving character, the game has an excellent set of projectile weapons that can power up to 3 times each and are just a lot of fun to use. Yuko also has a quick slide that plays very well in many of the game's boss fights. The final boss in particular was extremely intense, and beating him on stream was definitely one of my personal favorite gaming moments of the year.
What? You do it?
Yeah. My heart is like pounding so hard.
Of course I spent time with some classics this year, although not nearly as many as last. Most of the older games that I started on our Sunday night livestream, I never ended up returning to. Guess I should get better at that, huh? I finally got around to Rocket Knight Adventures this year, which, I know, I should have played this a long time ago. I'd always heard that it was a pretty tough game, and I guess that just had me procrastinating on it. Turns out it was the absolute perfect difficulty, and I even almost finished it on the hardest difficulty immediately after finishing it the first time. This is a game where you've really got to learn how each of the numerous boss encounters progress, but once you do, it's extremely fulfilling. Mastering each of the moves in your repertoire is important, and knowing when to use them is key. I think people get caught up on using the dash move, and they fail to realize that the basic sword slash is actually more powerful and much more versatile. It's a reasonably long game, but each level offers a completely different experience, which makes it move pretty quick and never gets old. This is 16-bit era Konami at its most refined, and it's incredible that this has never gotten any kind of re-release on download services. Gate of Thunder is a TurboGrafx-16 CD game that I've always talked about in the past, but I finished it this year and it really made me settle on it being probably my favorite shooter of all time. There's not a whole lot of frills to it. I mean, weapon power-ups are fairly straightforward, but it's such a pure shooter experience that I find myself being able to come back to it repeatedly. A big allure is obviously the hard rockin' soundtrack, which is a nearly perfect mix of wailing guitars and synths. If only the sound balance was a little bit better. But there are hacked versions out there that fix this up. I guess one of the things I love the most about it is that it's not insanely difficult, which can scare off a lot of people from playing shooters in the first place. The basic difficulty is beatable after enough attempts by anyone with a passing interest in shooting games. For those of you that want more of a challenge, you're definitely going to meet your match by switching to hard mode. While we're on the subject of the TurboGrafx CD-ROM, we gotta talk about FX Unit Yuki, the Henshin engine. This successful Kickstarter game is a tribute to the PC Engine's life, with levels inspired by Rondo of Blood, Adventure Island, and even Magical Chase. Despite being a backer, I didn't follow the development of this too closely, so when it showed up this past summer, I was pleasantly surprised. Yuki's top-notch soundtrack really roped me in, and combined with its basic, yet fun platforming action, you've got a Kickstarter game that definitely delivered on its promise. I mean, there is a couple of weird graphical glitches here and there, but it seemed to be pushing the hardware in ways that not a lot of games on the system did. But these should be cleared up in the eventual Dreamcast port that's on the way. Last year, I was exposed to the brilliance of Spanish developer Loco Molido, with the incredible ghouls and ghosts like Curse Castilla. This year, I had the pleasure to play his tribute to classic shooting games like Gradius and Super Hydra.
Delta lands. Our option force has been detected in the sector. Engage.
Okay, ready to rock, Colonel.
Unit 87, take off.
Like Castilla, Hydra takes the basic look and premise of its inspiration and streamlines the heck out of it. While dying in Gradius means that it might be impossible to finish, Hydra gives you additional weapons to add to your loadout after each level, allowing you to pick the best gun, bombs, and super weapon for each area. It may be tough as nails, but the level variety here makes for a very fulfilling ride. I really fell in love with Hydra when I hit the Space Armada, which are usually my favorite type of level in a game. One of the first games I finished this year was McDonald's Treasureland Adventure, which shouldn't be confused with the other McDonald's game, Global Gladiators. Treasureland Adventure stars creepy old Ronald McDonald, and was one of the very first games from Treasure, who had this in development simultaneously with Gunstar Heroes. Yes, a McDonald's game was one of my favorites of the year, which sounds absolutely crazy to say out loud. But what can I say? The combination of interesting boss battles, tried and true platforming, and Ronald's bizarre jumping animation was extremely memorable to me.
Perhaps the defining characteristic of the current generation of gaming for me has been the physical releases of smaller titles that in the previous generation probably would have been only available as digital downloads. You know, it certainly doesn't hurt that a lot of these games don't take that long to beat, so that's always nice when I'm lacking for playtime. One of the most unique games I played through in the past year was Severed by Drinkbox Studios, the developer behind the excellent Guacamelee, which I also played this year via the physical release from V-Blank Entertainment. Severed was originally released in 2016, and I played the 2018 Vita physical release by PlayAsia. In Severed, you play as a girl trying to save her family from an extremely twisted alternate dimension. Navigating through an old-school first-person dungeon crawler perspective, RPG battles play out with a unique touch-based battle system where you slash enemies and sever monster parts to collect and spend on character upgrades. While I feel that gameplay would probably be more comfortable with Wii Remote-style pointer controls instead of a touchscreen, the battle system is unconventional in a good way, and it works better than you might expect. Severed manages to build a truly creepy world with such a simple art style, and the haunting soundtrack becomes more oppressive as the game progresses. So if you have any room in your heart for touch input, give it a try on Vita, Wii U, 3DS, Switch, or iOS. Earlier in the year, Limited Run Games did a PS4 release of Cairo Blaster by the creator of Cave Story, but it's a very different, more linear sort of action game. It plays great, sounds great, and of course has a very charming style, though I don't think it ever took hold in the collective gaming consciousness to the extent that Cave Story did. The long-awaited Owlboy came to the Nintendo Switch in 2018, and I thought it was a perfect fit for the portable screen. This is a surprisingly story-driven little adventure, less Metroid-y than I expected, but full of fun action and great moments. Easily one of the best games I beat in 2018 was Cuphead, but that sadly was not on a physical copy. Hopefully Microsoft does the right thing in 2019 and gives us a fully patched Xbox One physical disc with the DLC included. In 2018, I tried to start a tradition that I only about half lived up to. The idea was to pick a game that I love, play through it once every month of the year, and in doing so I would learn it well enough over the course of a year's worth of runs to add it to my stable of games that I could in the future pick up just for a casual replay anytime. For 2018, I chose the original Castlevania for NES. While I only ended up actually playing through it 5 or 6 times instead of the intended 12, I did manage to get good enough to finish in under 30 minutes without using any continues. We'll see if I can retain those skills over the coming years. The most interesting thing I learned along the way was that while Dracula is stun locked by holy water, you can just walk straight through him. Thanks to Sephi for dropping the hot tips in the stream chat. Of course, I played a number of other games in 2018, but there's just no way to talk about all of them here. And some, like Kirby Star Allies, maybe I'll get the chance to go more in depth with that in a future episode. There were also some disappointments. Life is Strange Before the Storm told a thoroughly unexciting prequel story that absolutely did not need to be told. Danganronpa V3 had its moments, but sort of drove the series into the ground by the end. And well, I've already talked plenty about Perfect Dark Zero in its own episode. But on the bright side, Perfect Dark Zero also led me to rediscover the greatness of Time Splitters 2. Wow, what a game! So good!
Of course, this year was met with its fair share of disappointments, and probably the biggest for me was Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I was a huge fan of the first game in this reboot series, playing through it a number of times on both the PS3 and the PS4. I had a lot of fun with Rise as well, but ultimately came away feeling a bit ambivalent about it. Regardless, I was still excited for Shadow, starting it fairly close to release. It was also the first game I played fully in 4K with HDR. And it starts out pretty great. The atmosphere and graphics are fantastic in the early parts of the Cozumel section. But then, a story beat happens and absolutely killed my opinion of Lara's character, which made it really tough to get into the rest of the narrative. By the end, I didn't feel any kind of attachment to the world or the plot. I could barely understand what the lead villain's motivation was, but I kind of felt like Lara was just as bad.
You set the apocalypse in motion. Do you realize the tragedy you have unleashed?
Believe me, this isn't the kind of thing that usually bothers me, but she just comes across as supremely unlikable in this game.
The cleansing has begun. It falls to me now to stop it before it consumes us all.
Shadow takes more of an open world approach, which is usually a negative for me. The same thing happened with the transition from Batman Arkham Asylum to Arkham City. But it didn't help that the power progression of equipment and Lara's skills felt almost entirely useless this time around. Of course, it was still a great looking game, and the HDR was stunning. But what a way to fizzle out on the finale of this reboot series. I have a feeling that they'll need to retool everything from the ground up for whatever direction Lara heads in next. Firmly in the what the heck, this is a mess column is Arc System's Double Dragon 4. On paper and in screenshots, this is the kind of throwback I can get behind, taking inspiration from the NES version of Double Dragon 2. In action though, I have no idea what happened here. The screen tearing is absolutely out of control and completely destroys whatever potential there is for this being a retro revival on the same scale as Mega Man 9. I'd heard that this game was rushed out with no real testing, but it's insane that this has never been fixed via patch even today. Talk about being sent to die, and also betraying consumers' trust. This was such a colossal waste. This next one might ruffle some feathers, but I didn't have a lot of fun with Axiom Verge. To be clear, I'm not saying that it's a bad game, but it just didn't resonate with me at all, which is disappointing because I expected to like it a lot more than I did. It has a really interesting plot that goes in unexpected directions, along with some unique power-ups and gameplay mechanics, but I felt like by the end, every button on the controller did something different, and it felt overly complicated, making it especially difficult to play on the Switch in portable mode. The music and world had atmosphere so thick, but I don't know, maybe I'm just bored of Metroidvanias nowadays. But maybe not, because The Messenger was freaking awesome. What starts out as an homage to Ninja Gaiden, and some of the intense platforming of Super Meat Boy, eventually expands into a time-traveling Metroidvania with a mix of 8 and 16-bit graphics. I was unsure about the writing at first because it felt a bit too jokey, but the story of the game evolved in such a way that I got really into it. This is a pretty lengthy adventure too, and it ended up being far longer than I ever expected. There's such a fluidity to the gameplay in The Messenger that truly makes you feel like you can do anything. And by the end of the game, you basically can. It doesn't overcomplicate things. You have your entire moveset about a quarter of the way into the game. A stark contrast to Axiom Verge. Now, to see the Metroidvania formula perfected, you need only look at what was probably my most anticipated release of this year, Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom.
Your journey began, it's time to go. The power of change will...
An incredible new entry in the Wonder Boy series, which ended up being both of our favorite game of the year. You know a game is special when you really start arranging your schedule around playing the game. If a game is good enough, you find time to play it. Sometimes at the expense of other things you should be doing.
What impresses me most about Monster Boy is that the game is not afraid to challenge you in ways that other games shy away from. The action is perfectly tuned, often demanding a lot of precision, while still being forgiving enough to let you try and try again. I'm not talking like Meat Boy levels of ridiculousness or anything, but it's just the right level of difficulty for fans of old school platforming. Much more platforming challenge than you might normally expect to see in Metroidvania style games.
Exactly, and not just that, I felt that Monster Boy really makes you think in a way that feels all but lost in modern gaming. Puzzle solutions, especially those that lead to enticing optional upgrades, are typically not at all obvious at a glance. It seems like most games these days really don't want the player to feel confused for too long, but Monster Boy's puzzles are such that you might often have to walk away and come back later. But in the end, the solutions are very satisfying and make perfect sense. There's something to discover on basically every single screen, and between Try and I, we were able to solve nearly every mystery in the game before any FAQs or other information was available, which made for a super fulfilling experience.
Not only is Monster Boy Game of the Year for both of us, the soundtrack has to easily be the best of the year too. With an all-star music team including Yuzo Koshiro, Michiru Yamane, and others, the most surprising thing is that even with its excellent remixes of past Monster World series themes, these are often debatably overshadowed by the incredible original compositions. Is this the best grassy field theme of all time?
As 2018 closes, I regret that I haven't had time to play some of the year's biggest titles. No, I still haven't played Spider-Man, God of War, and perhaps most unfortunately, Dragon Quest XI. But these games aren't going anywhere, and won't be less good when I undoubtedly make time for them in 2019. An important takeaway is that a good game is always a good game, no matter when you play it. And I hope to find many more in the coming year.